Hello and welcome to the MCU Body Count, where I'll be revealing just how deadly the so-called heroes of the Marvel Cinematic Universe actually are. I'll be going over their appearances across the franchise and tallying up just how many people each hero put into the ground. Right now, the plan is for this series to cover the original 6 Avengers, namely Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, the Hulk, Black Widow, and Hawkeye. If this does well, I may continue on and deal with heroes introduced in Phase 2 of the MCU, or maybe even look at some DC heroes, but let's not get ahead of ourselves, because we need to kick this whole project off with the one and only Tony Stark, aka Iron Man. Iron Man made his comic book debut in Tales of Suspense number 39 in 1963. The story was plotted by Stan Lee, scripted by his brother Larry Lieber, and drawn by Don Heck from a design by Jack Kirby, who also did the cover art for the issue. Despite a long history in comics, Iron Man was frequently thought of as something of a second-string superhero, never reaching the heights of the top-tier Marvel properties like Spider-Man, the X-Men, or even the Incredible Hulk. Now that all changed when his first live-action appearance hit screens, 2008's Iron Man, which kicked off the now gargantuan Marvel Cinematic Universe. Tony is a brilliant but spoiled industrialist, having inherited his father's business, the biggest component of said business being weapons manufacturing. But things take a turn when he's brought face to face with the devastation that his weapons bring to the world, and he's forced to build a suit of armor to escape capture, a suit he then refines into something he can use to try and make the world a better place. He's portrayed perfectly by Robert Downey Jr., who appeared to be able to channel some of his own troubled past in order to give Tony the humanity that he desperately needs in order to keep from being an unlikable douche.
You've been called the Da Vinci of our time. What do you say to that?
Absolutely ridiculous. I don't paint.
And what do you say to your other nickname, the Merchant of Death?
That's not bad.
But douche or not, there's no question that Tony leaves a body count behind. The Iron Man armor, in addition to being a bludgeoning weapon in its own right, comes equipped with a wide variety of weapons, including missiles, tiny guided darts, and, of course, the repulsors. Though normally used for flight, they can be used to blast people with considerable force. Let's take a look at how Tony puts these weapons to use and start running down the body count. We of course kick things off with where the entire MCU started, Iron Man 1. Though there starts being a body count pretty early into the film, Tony himself doesn't start racking up kills until he breaks out of the cave where he's being held captive by the terrorist organization, the Ten Rings. And since I'm not doing full recaps of these movies, we're gonna start there. But boy, once he gets started, he does some serious damage. We start off with these two guys taken out when the door is blown off. Now, I suppose this is as good a place as any to acknowledge I'm going to be using my own judgment on what does or doesn't look like a fatality to me. This isn't based off any realistic injury assessment. I didn't consult with medical professionals. This really is just my own gut instincts, as well as my knowledge of the tropes of action films. In other words, villains, especially minions and grunt types, go down permanently from injuries that the heroes would just walk off if they took. But that also doesn't mean that every single hit and slam counts as a kill. I am going by how lethal it looked to me based on physical impact, narrative, and film framing, and also whether or not there's any movement after they go down if we get any further shots of them. Which brings us back to the two taken out by this door when it gets blasted off. Now, I could buy that they survived, except we get a follow-up shot soon after, and they are down and out for good so far as I can tell. I did decide to credit these kills to Tony, even though his buddy Jensen probably would have been involved in rigging up the entire bomb setup. And I'm giving Tony the kills because I decided to, okay? You want to do it different, you can do your own count. Jeez, why are you so confrontational about this? Calm down. Anyways, once the suit is fully powered, Tony gets to work escaping the cave. I'm counting this guy punched across the frame because if he could still do anything at all, he'd have kept shooting after he landed. Under other circumstances, I might count that as a knockout, but as we are about to see, Tony isn't going light on these guys. Not at all. We've got these two slammed into the wall, which I'm going to count as kills, largely because of how crunchy the impact sound effects are. Now, I went back and forth on whether or not to count this guy who gets punched in the head straight into the ground. On the one hand, it's a direct hit to the head and he goes down very hard. On the other hand, Tony doesn't actually have metal fists in this first iteration of the Iron Man armor. It's actually heavy-duty work gloves, as we see in an earlier close-up. But ultimately, I am going to count it again due to the crunch sound effect used for impact. As Mark 1 Iron Man works his way down the hall, we have another 3 going down with extremely crunchy hits. Tony is pissed, and he is not holding back during this entire thing, which is the same reason I'm going to count this guy who gets locked in with Tony. We only hear that he stops screaming to be let out, so we don't really know what Tony did to cut him off. But given the headspace Tony appears to be in, I don't see him going non-lethal on the guy, so I'm going to count it. Next up, we get this guy flattened by a very heavy door, and this guy gets clotheslined. Although the clotheslining is not as crunchy an impact as some of the others, it is direct to the head with a metal part of the arm. So I'm going to count it based on what I said before about how pissed Tony is and how much lethal intent he appears to have throughout this. Next, we've got this guy who goes in for a headshot on our hero and it ricochets right back at him. It's not exactly an intentional kill on Tony's part, but I am going to count it because the suit was built in a way that allowed this to happen. Plus, let's be honest, even if it didn't happen that way, Tony would have crunched him a second later regardless. Next up, we get sort of a leader figure who goes down from proximity to a rocket blast, but he shows up later in the film, so we know this one isn't fatal, even though I might have counted it as such otherwise. It does leave him with some pretty serious scarring, though. Once Tony's out of the cave, it's time for the flamethrowers. We get 2 terrorists fully engulfed in flame. I'm also going to count this guy who's on fire and stumbles backwards into more fire. Then we get this guy who's blown back when Tony ignites some of the munitions. And from there, the baddies actually put 2 and 2 together about what they should be doing, and they start retreating, even as they continue to try and gun him down. Tony, at this point, also shifts his own focus onto destroying the weapons and putting much less emphasis on taking out the terrorists. But when he takes off, it is very explosive, and we get this gunner on the hill fully engulfed in flames by the takeoff. Now, even though we only see that one guy for sure taken out, the blast is so big that I'm going to count all the baddies that are in the preceding shots shooting at Tony because they did not have time to get clear of all this. By my count, that adds 7 because we have 2 separate close-ups of these 2 guys in cover, and then there's this group shot of 5 of them who are out in the open. Now, I am presuming at this point that any additional members of the 10 rings that we might have seen earlier have already fled, even though it's possible they might have been caught up in the blast too. The thing is, there's no way for me to go back and say count the folks who were out in the open when Tony first exits the caves, who I didn't already count as dead. I can't really include them because I don't know where the physical proximity is during the takeoff, and I risk double counting the ones that I've already listed here. So even though it's possible he took out more than I'm giving him credit for, I am going to leave it here. Tony makes it home, and then things go quiet for a while on the killing front. Well, that is until Tony decides to go and inject himself into a hostage situation with his newly upgraded suit. We're going to start with this punch that sends a guy flying back into a wall. Given the airtime and the dent that he leaves in the concrete, I'm going to count that as a kill. Next up, we've got Repulsor Blast, which is one of those things that it's pretty debatable and a bit of a case-by-case basis on whether or not these should be counted as lethal. It probably depends quite a bit on proximity. Now, this guy goes back hard and leaves a pothole in the wall behind him, so I'm saying that's fatal. Partially because of how hard he would have had to have been blasted to make that dent and then the dent itself. Out of the next 2 blasts that Tony lets off, I'm only going to count the first one as a kill. My logic here is that this guy is even closer than the one we saw get knocked into a wall, so even without concrete to slam into, he's getting a much harsher blast. This last guy is at the furthest distance and just goes tumbling over some crates comparatively gently, so I'm going to say he's more likely unconscious, or maybe he did the smart thing and fled the scene. Next up, Tony uses some, I guess I'm going to call these needle shots. Using an auto-targeting system, Tony takes out a cluster of baddies before they can harm civilians. Now, to my eye, there were only 5 of these guys, but Tony's targeting system picks out 6. And one of those appears to be shadowed in the truck, who I just couldn't make out with the naked eye. So, you know what? I'll trust the system and I'll count it. And yes, I am going to count these as kills, despite not being entirely sure exactly what it is that Tony's shooting at them, because these guys just flat out drop. There is no evidence that these are tranquilizer darts. It's not like they swoon as they go down, they're just out. Next up, Tony has his encounter with a tank, blowing it up in one of the film's iconic images. So the question here is, how many got taken out in the tank explosion? Well, I did look into this. A standard modern tank crew consists of 4 people: commander, gunner, loader, and driver. But that doesn't guarantee that there were 4 people in that tank. Technically, one person can operate a tank on their own, just not very efficiently, since they'd have to be constantly moving about inside the tank to different positions in order to load the gun, aim the gun, or drive the tank to a different position. So that means that this blast could count for anywhere from 1 to 4 for our purposes. Ultimately, I opted to split the difference and call it 2. But I'm not just going by averages for that. I do have a logic behind it. Given the resources of the terrorists, it seems unlikely that it would have been properly manned with a full crew. Plus, we never actually see the tank move. However, the aiming and firing is done efficiently enough that I think there's 2 guys in there. A loader and a gunner, but probably no driver and no commander. So that is 2 more for Mr. Stark. Shortly after that, Tony blows up some Jericho missiles, presumably killing any 10 Rings members in the immediate proximity. Now, by my count from what we see, that brings in another 7. Now, even though the movie isn't over, that's actually going to wrap things up for the first Iron Man as far as a kill count goes, because we know the pilot in the jet that Tony wrecked made it out okay. The film made a point of making that clear. And I'm going to credit the death of the big baddie, Obadiah Stane, to Pepper Potts for being the one to throw the switch and end him. Sure, it was Tony's plan, but she's the one who executed it. No pun intended. Okay, maybe a little intended. But that brings us to Iron Man 2, in which Tony kills nobody. Seriously, it is a big fat 0. All the destruction logically might have had some collateral damage, but there's nothing in shot that ever confirms or even indicates the possibility of that. Plus, all the baddies that Tony takes out are robots. Even the main villain, Whiplash, ends up blowing himself up because he's a sore loser. So, yeah, Tony's got clean hands in this outing. Next comes the big team up, the Avengers. And this is where I need to remind folks who may not have watched my intro video for this series, I'm only counting kills of what I'm comfortable considering to be sentient and or sapient beings. I'm not counting anything that behaves as a hive mind or an unthinking horde. Now, the Chitauri are probably the group I'm going to get the most pushback over lumping them into the horde category. I don't think I'll get too many objections over considering the Ultron bots or whatever these things were that bulked out Thanos' army as hordes or mindless beasts. And I'll grant that the Chitauri can appear to operate with individual thought, but the clincher on this for me was the fact that when the mothership is blown up, they all drop dead. That to me says that they function as a group, not as individuals. Space Wi-Fi goes down, and they drop. And it's not even like their life support systems cacked it. They're not struggling to breathe or succumbing to earthly infection. They just drop. And to cement this standpoint, I even did a little extra research. A bit of official lore that was tied to the TV show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. describes a Chitauri neural link, and it includes the following sentence. The Chitauri are of a hive mind, a singular collective of alien cyborg-like creatures working as one to overwhelm their enemies. Okay, so technically it said cyborg-like, not cyborg-like, but that looks like a typo and a piece of bonus content that was probably given to an intern to type up. But my point is, these are not to be considered as individual creatures, so they don't get counted. However, I do feel it's safe to assume that on the mothership, or possibly even the mothership itself, was some kind of controlling intelligence, be it organic or cybernetic, and that was taken out by the nuke that Tony redirected. So, you know what? You can have 1 for that, Tony, as a treat. That brings us to Iron Man 3, and yes, Tony does start racking up the bodies again. After publicly challenging the terrorist leader, the Mandarin, Tony's home is attacked by helicopters. Tony is forced to use an Iron Man suit that isn't actually combat ready, but in a clever bit of improvising, he uses his repulsors to launch a grand piano at one of the helicopters. Now, much like with the tank in the first Iron Man, I gotta make a call on how many people I think went down with this thing. We get an earlier shot of a different helicopter that shows the pilot and one other person in the passenger seat. So it's tempting to say that there's two people in each chopper. However, on closer inspection during a zoom close-up of the pilot who gets a piano to the face, I don't see anyone in the passenger seat. Plus, we get a quick side shot that appears like nobody's in the back either, so I'm only gonna give credit for the one kill. Old Buckethead has to be creative with the next chopper too. His weapon systems aren't fully powered, but there's still some armaments that he has, so he grabs a missile that he can't actually launch, throws it at the helicopter, and then blows it up with a repulsor blast. Now, as before, I'm only going to count this as one kill, because a later shot confirms the surviving chopper is the one that we know had two guys in it. There is also a quick interior shot of the helicopter that gets blown up, and it only shows the pilot. And while it's from an angle that it can't be said as definitively that there was nobody in the passenger seat, ultimately, I have no evidence of a second person ever being there, so I'm only going to count it as the one. The third helicopter wrecks Tony's home, sending it and Tony into the Pacific Ocean and leaving him for dead. Later in the movie, Tony, now suitless, faces off against some baddies powered by a regenerative treatment called Extremis. This makes them stronger and deadlier, but Extremis also gives people a tendency to, let's say, overheat. Tony's able to take down the first of these durable fighters by releasing gas into a room and then placing metal dog tags in a microwave to spark and ignite the gas. It's actually one of the fun things about this entry in the franchise, how much it requires Tony to get by without his high-tech suit, or at least not all the functions he normally has on it. That said, the suit, or at least part of it, does come into play for taking down the next Extremis soldier, with Tony delivering a full repulsor blast to this guy's face. Now, I was really ready to count this guy, whose name's Savin, by the way, as a kill. But I noticed later that he's the same guy who takes over Air Force One a little bit later in the movie, so I guess not. That said, I do feel like it's safe to say that he only survived due to Extremis, and any normal human would have had their ticket punched by that blast, which would reaffirm my belief that the repulsors can be lethal by themselves at a high enough charge or close enough range. Later on in the movie, Tony infiltrates a Miami mansion where he believes the Mandarin is hiding, and there's some pretty iffy non-lethal takedowns I went back and forth on. There's some straightforward stuff that's clearly non-lethal, like a tranquilizer dart and a taser takedown, but then there's these two guys who have small explosive devices go off in extreme proximity to their heads. Ultimately, I did decide not to count them. Going back to what I said in the first Iron Man, you may remember that on questionable instances in that one, I leaned in favor of counting them as kills because Tony appeared to be going about things with lethal intent. So, by the same token, but on the other side of it, given how non-lethal the earlier means are, the plan on Tony's part seems to be just to knock the guards out. And while that doesn't preclude an unintended kill, I'm going to say Tony was successfully non-lethal here. And I did double check. This guy in the fountain, his head's not underwater when Tony leaves him. Later on, while escaping from capture, I am going to say that Tony definitely kills this guy with a repulsor blast. Now, it's at a distance that could go either way in a vacuum, but Tony told the guy straight up he'd kill him just a few minutes before.
I'm gonna kill you first.
I'm going to say he succeeded in that. He knocks the other guard around, but it didn't look fatal to me. A little bit later, Tony does shoot one of the guards, so I am going to count that. He then slams another into the wall and flips him over, though again, that second guy didn't look like he took hits hard enough to die from. There's one more guard, but rather than fight, he gives this amazing line.
Honestly, I hate working here. They are so weird.
And very smartly runs away. Next up, Iron Man goes against Savin on Air Force One. And while the repulsor blast to the face before didn't kill this guy, the chest blast definitely goes straight through him and also the wall behind him. And that's actually going to wrap us up for the final Iron Man movie. Because you see, the big climactic battle has extremist soldiers fighting unmanned armor, what Tony calls the house party protocols. The call I had to make here was whether or not to give Tony credit for any kills done by the unmanned armor, since, to be fair, he made them and ordered them into the situation. Ultimately, I decided not to, though, because he actually has his AI butler, Jarvis, controlling them.
Jarvis, target extremist heat signatures disable with extreme prejudice.
And Jarvis is established in the next Avengers film to be borderline sentient on his own. Now, if I ever do Phase 2 heroes and cover Vision, I'll have to decide whether or not to count Jarvis kills towards Vision's total, but that's a problem for future me, so have fun with that. As for the big baddie, one Aldrich Killian, like Obadiah Stane before him, he gets taken down by Miss Pepper Potts. Seriously, Tony, she never stops taking out your trash.
I do anything and everything that Mr. Stark requires, including occasionally taking out the trash.
Now it's time for the next big team up, and let me say this up front. This opening action scene in the Age of Ultron, it was a nightmare to try and get an accurate count on. Between how fast it all happens, trying to figure out what should or shouldn't be counted as fatal, and just flat out counting the number of guys who get knocked down or around, this was a huge pain in my ass. But here we go. Tony kicks off his count by blowing up this turret, and we see a little bit later in the movie that these are manned by 2 soldiers, so I'm going to give him 2 kills for that. Next up comes this tank, and I agonized a bit over who should get credit for this, because Thor flips it in the air, Tony blows up the underside, and then Hulk throws it who knows where. I decided I wasn't going to give it to Hulk just for being the last one to touch it, so for me, it was between Thor and Tony. To my way of thinking, Thor's hit would have killed them when the tank landed, but not from the initial impact of the hammer. However, Tony's explosion to the underside probably did the job before the thing ever had the chance to hit the ground, much less get thrown around by the Hulk. Now, in Iron Man 1, I did hem and haw a bit over how many kills a tank explosion should count as, but that was for a guerrilla terrorist group. This is Hydra, and Hydra is properly trained and well armed. So for my money, I'm saying that the tank has a full crew, so that's 4 added to the count. From there, he hurls this guy into a tree at very high velocity, and if skiing into a tree was enough to take out Sonny Bono, I'm saying this is enough to count that guy as dead. Iron Man then blows up what looks like a gated checkpoint, but I couldn't confirm if anybody was close enough to be counted as a kill, so he gets nothing for that.
Shit! Language!
Next, we see him strafe the Hydra base, and when the shot starts, we've got 2 already on the ground that he presumably already took out. Then there's this cluster of guys on the stairs. Now, though there's 6 Hydra agents here, I'm only going to count 3 kills. 3 is how many shots Tony fires, and though all 6 go tumbling, I'm making the assumption that the 3 who were not directly hit are just being knocked over by the ones who were. Tony then comes in for a landing, blasting 2 over the rails and then a 3rd soon after. We've already gone over how deadly the repulsors can be on their own at close enough range. Plus, if there is a railing, that's probably not an insignificant drop he just sent them over. Tony does not seem to be holding back during this initial attack, because next up, we get this absolute massacre. So I'm not going to count the first airborne guy Tony hits, because firstly, the guy's armored. Secondly, he really only gets punched. Quite hard, but again, the armor thing. The next airborne gent I am going to count because Tony blasts him. And then there's all these guys on the ground. And that's tricky because of the cuts in the editing in terms of getting a count. I could easily have either missed a few or double counted, but to my eye, there's 10 of these guys who go down before Tony obliterates the truck. Next up is the question of how many people does he get credit for the truck explosion. My initial instinct was that the truck was transporting fighters to the battle, but there's a brief flash from inside where we actually see some of the interior of the truck lit up, and there's no silhouettes of people illuminated, plus no signs of bodies when he comes out the other end. So based on that, I'm only going to count the driver. So adding up the earlier ones, that's 12 taken out in this stretch. Next, Tony breaks into the Hydra base, and in doing so, he hits these 2 guys on entry, but they just look like they got knocked down the stairs. However, there's these 6 guys, and Tony breaks out the needle shots. And these guys all go down, including an unarmed guy who was cowering behind a map. Nice one, Tone. Although, hey, look at that. It's non-fatal. It's an odd point in the battle to decide to stop using lethal force, but hey, baby steps, I suppose. Oh, and before anyone asks, no, this does not mean I'm going to reconsider these needle shots as deadly from when I talked about them in the first Iron Man. In that one, the guys went down and stayed down. In this one, they're clutching their legs and the like. So it looks to me like these things can still be lethal. Tony just didn't aim for deadly spots on the body this time around.
It's good talking.
No, it wasn't.
So he actually gets nothing for this bit. I am, however, going to count this unarmed scientist type because he doesn't get up and we don't hear even a moan from him after taking this hit. Plus, afterwards, Tony puts the suit into quote-unquote sentry mode, and it's not keeping an eye on the guy on the ground, it's looking around for potential new threats, presumably because it knows that guy is definitely not getting back up. Later on, there's the fight in the tanker with Claw's goons, but Tony's focus is pretty much exclusively on Ultron, so no kills there. We also have the fight between the Hulkbuster and the Hulk, and during that, we get this moment where Tony throws Hulk hard into an oncoming truck, like right at the driver's cabin. And I'm sorry, Tony, but I'm counting that as a kill, because there was no way the driver survived that, and the Hulk only landed there because you threw him. I know you went out of your way to avoid civilian casualties as established later, but I think you killed somebody there. From here on out, the rest of this film is all Ultron bots, which act as a horde, and I do not count individual bots as sentient, so we're moving on. In Captain America Civil War, since the majority of combat is between the heroes, there aren't going to be any fatalities in something like the airport fight. There are some kills in the opening action scene where the Avengers go up against Crossbones and his goons, but Tony isn't involved in that, so that's another kill-free outing for the Iron Dude. Tony's next major appearance is in Spider-Man Homecoming, and while he does do some stuff in the Iron Man suit, none of it is actually taking on the villain or even the villain's minions, so it's another case of zero body counts. And now that brings us to Infinity War, a film kinda notorious for its body count. But once again, I'm counting the bulk of Thanos' forces as a horde, so the heroes don't actually get that many kills that I would count. But, you know what does count? Thanos' lieutenants. So that means Tony gets himself a kill by causing Ebony Maw here to be sucked out into space. It may have been Spider-Man's idea, but Tony executed it, and I did mean the pun that time. This is, however, Tony's only kill in this movie. And that brings us finally to Endgame. Now, as with Infinity War, the majority of kills are on mindless horde beasts and the Chitauri, so huge chunks of the action scenes don't feature any deaths that count for the purposes of this show. However, Thanos himself and his lieutenants, they still count. Now, prior to Tony doing his own snap, Cull Obsidian was crushed by Scott Lang in giant form, and Corvus Glaive got taken down by Okoye. Proxima Midnight is a little bit tougher to track. You see, the actress for the voice and the facial capture, Carrie Coon, couldn't make the Endgame shoot due to scheduling conflicts. Now, Proxima Midnight is still seen in some of the long shots and group shots played by stuntwoman Monique Ganderton, so she's definitely there. But since Coon couldn't do the facial capture, she gets no close-ups and no spotlight. So while it is possible she died during the battle like Obsidian and Glaive did, we don't see it happen, so I'm going to assume she's still alive when Tony snaps Thanos' forces away. So that means Tony gets 3 for his sacrifice play. 1 for Proxima Midnight, 1 for Ebony Maw, who we do in fact see get dusted, and of course, Thanos himself. So that closes out the murderous rampage of one Anthony Edward Stark, aka Iron Man. How many bodies did he leave in his wake? Well, let's run the numbers and find out. In his time as Iron Man, Tony Stark racked up a total body count of 82, with over half of that coming from his very first film. Having significant appearances in 9 Marvel films, because I'm not going to count something like the cameo in The Incredible Hulk, that means that on average, Tony killed 9.11 people per film. Of the 82 I am crediting him with, 77 of them were humans of some form, with 2 having enhancements from extremists and 1 being a poor, innocent truck driver. Tony only had 5 non-human kills, although one of those non-human kills was the big baddie daddy of them all, Thanos. I almost want to count that as more than 1, but in the end, he's just one guy, like everybody else, no matter what he claims to be.
I am inevitable.
You know what else is inevitable? the end of this inaugural entry in the MCU body count. Now, next month, I'll be taking a look at how many bodies have been left behind by the first Avenger, Captain America, aka Steve Rogers. He had 7 appearances to Tony Stark's 9, but given how many times Tony didn't notch any kills at all, he still might be able to give the old metalhead a run for his money. Tune in next month to find out. And that wraps us up. If you want to support this project or anything else that I do, Patreon is the best way to do that. But I really want to get your comments on this. What do you think of this project? What do you think about how deadly Tony ended up being? Was it more than you thought? Was it less? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. All the like, share, and subscribe stuff helps me out as well. But what I really want you to remember, my friends, is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You're the council, I'm just running the meetings, and until next time, this council is adjourned. Now my thanks to my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Karak, The Thing That Goes Doink in the Anime, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Udelki, The Oath of Boyd, Bernabilax the Poodle, Zach, Idolin, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperol, Bookworm, Adam, RDL Taylor, Shane Ross, Jay Gorley, Brendan LaRose, and TT. If you want to hear me possibly butcher your name, check out the rewards on the Patreon. And thanks to all you folks.